Fernando, over to you.
Yeah, welcome, Ara. And Sami, long time we don't see Sami here.
Danny.
And Donin just arrived.
Well,
Okay, let me get the numbers. 52, right, Carolina?
yes, 52.
52 gatherings. It's so nice. Yeah, I have the privilege to be inviting guest facilitators to this space. And now it's the turn for Augusto. And maybe I could talk longer about Augusto, but two things I think are important to say. He's also Brazilian. And he's also living abroad for a while. So Brazilians living in a different country, they have lots of stories to tell because we feel, at the same time, we feel that we can manage different situations. We always get this mirror and we can look ourselves better when we are outside of Brazil. And it's very interesting. So we have lots of stories to share. But one thing that brought me to attention in Augusto is his work about this blend of hosting people, but also combining with information data collected from with a software. So how can we merge these two things? And in the complex world that we are living in, it's so interesting to use both sides, the human side and the software side to get better results. So Augusto is deep into this work. I think many of you will be interested in his work as well. So today is just a snippet, just an appetizer of what can be done. And I hope it opens new doors for you. And feel free to get in touch with Augusto later and keep it going. Augusto, thank you again for making the time to be with us. And the floor
Thank
is
you,
yours, my
Fernando.
friend.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you very much. Hi, hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining this. I'm Augusto. I'm sitting here in San Francisco. I have a little bit of that story um, of being Brazilian born but being around. I'm new in this part of in this time zone and in this country. Before I was many years in England, so you're going to see I have a little bit of a mix, whatever way I say things that includes a good 8 years in the UK, and now here. And maybe I'm trying to say soccer instead of football, but I'm not there yet. So I've been here for 9 months only, so quite new. So the idea today is welcome everyone, and the idea today is to talk a little bit about this mix of hosting conversations that I've been. I can talk more about that later of my story to this, and also some story data, some narrative data, and how they, I believe, come very well together, and they help the work on facilitation in person, but also virtual facilitation, and knowing the work that Carolina and Fernando have been doing. And if you're here, it's because you're doing this work already. So just kind of an opportunity to share where I'm coming from, why they think this is an interesting and powerful way of engaging, and then we can just share a little bit about our experiences around that as well. Yeah. So we're going to start by um, using what you know and networking a little bit, just a bit focused on this topic, on the topic of what we've been here to explore. And then I'm going to come back to a little bit of the story of this work, and then we can open up for some conversation and questions and ideas. All right. So I guess, Carolina, you taking care of that? Yeah.
Yeah, so we are gonna do the improv networking to connect to each other. And so we have a question. I love this question that Augusto brought to us. Have you ever entered in a room just to find out that the conversation was not really about what you had been told or expected? And I can see some laughs here, so it was my reaction as well. So this is what you are gonna talk in the rooms. You're gonna be in pairs, 3 rounds, so you're gonna have the chance to talk your story with 3 different people. So share these stories with your partner. And yeah, I think we're ready. 4 minutes each round.
And just two things. Time. time will be ticking on top of the window. There will be a message when you get there. If you click the X to close that window, will be bounced back to the main room. So clicking OK. That message is just because Zoom shows if your mic and camera is open in the breakouts, just this. But some people close this window and they are just bounced back on the main room and they don't know why. It's Zoom, it's understanding that you don't accept this. So if you just click OK, you stay there and you have 4 minutes with your partner.
We'll have
Okay,
fun sharing stories.
here we go. I
Okay,
almost sneezed.
sound.
4 minutes, second round. Here we go.
Oh, John.
Hello, Sammy.
Hello, nice meeting you, Fernando.
Nice to see you again. Okay, third round. 4 more minutes with a new partner. The number of smiles on the screen
Here
are
we
growing.
go.
De vuelta. Everybody's back. Augusto, what should I do? Right?
Yes. Wonderful. Yes. Okay. So first, just one comment on impromptu networking and what you've just done, and I'm going to talk a little bit about participation. But I think one interesting thing is how things change when people can participate. Yeah, I was talking here with Fernando about being in places where the keynote speakers, and sometimes they make complete sense because you want to hear from someone who studied something that was interesting. But then how, when you open up for people to share their understandings or like their stories, their experiences, it all changes because you plug in into something that makes sense to you, or you have to process and make sense in order to share. So this is a little bit part of the work, and we'll connect that to narrative in a bigger scale. And in order to do that, I'd like to, one thing that we asked on the invitation, and I know some of you did it, but we're going to ask you to do it again. It's kind of short. We're going to share in the chat a link for a survey. It's a bit of an engagement survey. Usually, this is done so you can share in about 5 to 8 minutes. You can sometimes, if you can speak and record, but you can also type. And the idea is to share exactly the question that you've been sharing. Maybe you shared the same story a couple of times or 3 times. Maybe other stories came up. We're going to ask you to choose one of the stories you shared and then input into the platform. Why that? So we wanted to experience what people would do if you decide to use that in order to collect narratives and experience. So you can experience it first, then I can talk a little bit about it, and then we can move into discussion. Does that make sense? Super. So do we have the link in hand? Or yes, there it is. So if you can click it, and I'll check in about 5 minutes, or you can come back and give a thumbs up on Zoom when you're finished. It's your story, one of your stories, and then some questions after related to the stories. And we have David. I hope it's not Mission Impossible though. But thank you, Linda. Keep it going. Thank you, Dan. How's it going? One more minute. So this will be open and you can revisit if you want later. So it's not going to go away. It's just the experience once. Denise Cat is saying yes. Yes. Thank you, Evgeny. Rossi, thank you. Thank you, Salvatore. Is it fair enough if we move on? Yes? Super. Okay, so this will be open and you can look at it again. I think the idea is that you experience this because you will within in the story in some way. So now a short input from me before we share. So I think one thing working in facilitation and participation in particular that was a bit frustrating for my journey was some of those stories. That's when I'm invited to work by a client, by a leader, by a group of people. They tell me the story, what might be going on. And when I get there, that's not really the full story. It's only usually the part of the story that they can understand. And it's not that they're deceiving me. It's just that they only know what they know. And they're showing me this is the picture, but it's only the picture that they can see, right? So many times I've been to places where I've got there and it was only the first peel of the onion. There was more to go. And because we do work and we've been doing this work for some time, we know how to do this work into, okay, there's more to it. We can open up spaces and participation to listen to other voices. But as we do that, and obviously, as a rule of thumb, we have 2 or 3 hours to solve things that take 2 or 3 generations to move on. So by the time that we were able to peel the first onion or listen to more people, then time is up, or we need to continue at some other time. It's been considerably more difficult to bring people together, most definitely in person, sometimes online as well, because of time zones and people being spread out, or just time in general, because there's a lot of things to do. So my question has always been, how can we listen to people to understand what the conversation should be about or could be about even before we step into the room, being virtual, hybrid, or in person, the environment. And so over the years, and probably there are many ways to do. When I ask people, what do you do in order to be prepared to be in a room with people? Sometimes people will say, likely they'll say, I interview some people. We do some focus groups. Some will even say, I try to go to the organization or the team, sit in a corner and just listen to what's going on. Others will take a look at the documents and see the language people use and what is. So they try to figure out a little bit of the context in order to step in more contextualized. Yeah? And over time, even though I think this they're all obviously valid ways of doing the work. I drifted or found out narrative inquiry, and specifically participatory narrative inquiry, which is what I want to talk about, and it's the basis of this work. There's some interesting advantages and things that I think is worthy looking at when you're trying to understand complex issues, when you're trying to understand things that it's important to understand how people understand. Yeah. So I'm going to say this again. It's a bit of a, instead of listening to what the opinions people have, I want to listen to how they understand how things work, how they experience the organizing, how they experience being on that community, or how they experience their career development in the organization. Okay? So it's a bit of a, we call it a second order observation. I'm observing how people observe. Yeah? And I think that is, in narrative, it helps a lot, because a lot of things that we do in our work it is about how the world is, but it's also pretty much about how people see the world. And because we don't act necessarily on the basis of how things are, we also act on the basis of how we perceive things to be. And everything that's in the world is through us. Yeah, we don't get, there's no way we can access directly what is. We need to access through us. And therefore, the way we perceive, the interpretations that we make, they shape our decisions. They shape what we're going to do, what we're not going to do. So narrative inquiry and participatory narrative inquiry ask people, how do you perceive the place that you're in? How do you perceive organization? How do you perceive community? How do you perceive the topic that we are investigating? Rather than what is, tell me the facts. We ask, tell me your interpretation of what you're seeing. Tell me your experience about this. And we work from that premise. Yeah. So with my frustration and going towards this, I found 3 types of facilitation that require participation. Yeah. And I'm going to put this out because I know here people do this work. So it might be a way to weave in to the work that you're already doing. So those 3 things, the first one is, the first one is a bit of a content facilitation. Yeah? That also could require participation. So a little bit of the work that I've done, I spent in the UK some years as a teacher, yeah, for kids. On those years, and also in other places working with teachers, and I don't know who here have been in like teaching experiences in different ways. You can go there and you can say this stuff or the content, but you can also invite people to reflect on the content that was just shared. Yeah, so sharing the content is part of it, because otherwise people won't know, or the student won't know. But you can also create and facilitate participation for metacognition. So they understand where they're coming from, or they try to understand where this is going, or they understand the process of thinking on like topics like mathematics, for example, but where if you understand the process of generating the answer is much better than if you understand a formula or something that gives you the answer directly. So this is a valid way of using participation and facilitating participation when you hold the content or someone else and you sharing the content with the person. Another one, and I think that the second one is more, and they overlap, so they're not really 3 different, like completely separate ones. It's just for like exploration purposes here. So the second one is more like a process facilitation, which I would assume a lot of you do. And this is when you want the content to come from the group that you're working with. You don't necessarily understand the content deeply. You just understand briefly the context. And you create a space where people can bring the content out by different voices. You move people around. You use liberating structures. You use, So that's another type of, the role is different. So the role in the first case, we facilitate to support the context being spoken by other people's voices, being processed by other people's minds. Yeah? And in the second one, we want to see the content emerge and how they can meet with other contexts. The heads can meet with other, the internal process and understanding can weave with other people's. And the third one, which is again not a strict separation, but I call a facilitation for change. And I think the difference I put into this is facilitation for change will be one where our role is not to hold the content, is not to hold the process, although we do hold maybe a little bit of each, but it's to hold the process of transition that people have to go through. Yeah? And here there's a distinction that is important, that change and transition are very different things. Yeah, one thing is change, and change happens. Yeah, and change, the environment happens, it's a change, there's a merger and acquisition, there's a change, there's a policy change, and then you have to adapt. Like something more personal, someone in your family is sick, there's a change, or I don't know, anything that changed from A to B. And transition is how humans deal with that change, how we adapt with the process of change, how we move into. So I'm in the land of AI, right? That's all people talk about around here. So one thing is the change that AI will generate, and it will generate some changes. It's already out there. The other thing is how people will transition to that change, which is usually much harder than we as analog beings. So we're not digital. It takes time for us to get into it and to understand and make sense of things and how the change impact the way that we do things and etc. So facilitate transition means that sometimes we're going to input some content, sometimes we're going to host the process, and we can use all the things that you already use. But the idea is to sustain the anxiety that comes with change, which is natural and is part of being human. So when things change and we have to transition, there's anxiety, something that we had that it was structured and safe and known. Now it becomes unknown. It becomes different. And I have to deal with something that I haven't dealt before. And so that generates different levels of anxiety, but some anxiety in a way. So to facilitate the space of anxiety requires also different kind of work. It requires like we knowing our anxiety in working as facilitators. We knowing how people project anxiety on us, how we might receive those anxieties and project back to people as well. So there's a lot of learning that can be done and processes that can be learned in order to be a better container or to support the containment of that kind of transition. Okay. Why all that? That is to say, one of the things that I was going back to my frustrations is I was being invited to part of the story, to come to a room, and then trying to host participation, but within a specific context that was incomplete. Yeah, that most times people didn't want to talk about that because that was what the boss wanted to talk about. And then I was playing the role of selling what the boss wanted to talk about to those people. And that was very frustrating because that's not like the role of, so how things will change if change is what we want, how things will transition if the conversation is not the conversation that's supposed to happen, or at least it's not a conversation, it's not a difference that makes a difference. We're just reapplying, we're doing a very nice replay participatory conversation about something that does not matter much, or it's a cut of what the conversation could be. So how to solve that, or how to be more prepared into that? Because I like participation, I want to hear about other ways of looking at what's going on. But I couldn't do 20 interviews or 300 interviews, or because it's expensive, not only in terms of budget, but also in terms of time. But I wanted to hear a little bit of what the experiences of other people were. But I also didn't want to. I didn't want the experiences to be personal experiences in the sense of the different ways of looking at it, but not personal in the sense of I want to know, let's say, Anika's experiences or David's experiences in particular, but I want to know every personal experience in relationship. What that means is I want to know how people observe organization, but not to dissect what one person thinks about organization, but to understand the patterns of how people see organization. And so I'm depersonalizing, not because the personal is not important, but I'm depersonalizing in the sense that it's not about one person telling one thing, but about a group of people, even if small, they're talking about something that there's stuff in common in that. So it's not about only what one person might think out of, but it's about outliers, pattern outliers, not people outliers, which is also the case, but pattern outliers. And so I can bring pattern outliers to the conversation, because usually the conversation, so I'm a big fan, for example, of the World Cafe. Yeah, I've been in the board, international board of the World Cafe for many years. And I think it's a great method and a great way of convening. Yeah. But at the same time, when we convene in the World Cafe, and you probably all know about the World Cafe, eventually those small patterns that are not the strongest patterns, they get filtered out. Yeah. So this type of dissent gets filtered out because you're in the table and you talk about a topic and you move and you take what is common in the table. So usually what is most powerful prevails, but some of the things that we want to keep, it gets a bit lost. And so the World Cafe is not for everything and all the time, but it's still very powerful in many different places. So participatory narrative inquiry is what I found that I could send people, and of course it has its limitations like everything else, but if it was something that I could ask people to tell me their experiences, to judge their experiences. So what you've done now in the survey, you told the experience, and then we use some dyads and some triangles so you can place your experience, interpret your experience a little bit based on those topics. And then we can use those patterns that might come up of your interpretation to come up with hypotheses. What might be going on here? So why people are answering more on this side or more on that side, or they're considering more of this or more of that. Yeah. We also asked from demographics. So we might have asked like your gender. And sometimes we can filter by men and women. And not surprisingly, for example, we did work with career development. When we filter by men and women, that's very different. Right? And that's not a surprise, of course. And we know that career development for men and for women are different in many ways. But how it's specifically different in that organization, I cannot access if I ask generic abstract experiences. But I can access, or I can be closer to it when I go back and read what people wrote about it. So if I can get the sense of what people talk about it, like in this case, what the women say about career development, as opposed to what the men say about career development, I can have a better understanding, more practical, rather than abstract way of dealing with what are the things that we can do in order to close that gap, or in order to recognize that gap, or something like that. So that's the kind of work that narrative inquiry supports us to do. So I'd like to share with you what we've just done and one example of a real case, and then we can open up and have a chat. So I'll just go quickly to that so we have more time for our chat here. So just a second, because I lost my, okay. Wait, let me, I didn't want to share, okay, just the contents. You don't need to see my face. Okay, better. Thank you. So this is the background of the platform. You can check it out later. It's like free to access, and you can play around quite a bit. So this is what we've been exploring here. So this is the dashboard that comes out of the answers you've done. And so this dashboard will show us, so we had a total of 20 inputs, so 20 stories. And so this will show us like how many, like you also said, if it was a positive sentiment, if it was confusing, exciting, etc. So this is going to show you it's a positive, negative, or neutral kind of sentiment. You saw the modes of intervention, so fully in person, hybrid, some like fully virtual, so what the stories were related to, and your role, which in this case is most people are independent facilitators, and some answer others, and they probably have written what they've done. So what we have here is, what we want to use this for is, we want to see a little bit of the patterns of how the stories cluster and how we can look at them. So I'm not going to show everything because it might take more time than we have. But for example, we had 2 questions that we ask you to use in sliders that says, how often does this type of adaptation is needed to occur? And in the work that you've just done, or the story that you just experienced, to what extent participants were involved in the process beforehand? And then we have a graph. So in this case, 20 might not be enough to find patterns. So that's why I want to show you a real one that we gather more stories. But technically, every little dot here is a story. If you hover into it, you can see what the title or hashtag was. I didn't sign up for that. And when you click, it opens up the story and the answers that people gave. So it's a way to look at that. And you can also share some. So if you find a pattern somewhere, you can click and drag and have the 4 stories here. So this is a way of, I'm not going to read them, but I'm going to share with you this so you can read them. You can take a look at that if you want. You can also call the emotions. Anyway, you can play around with this. But the idea is that we want to find patterns. If you filter by role, you see if that's different from internal facilitator with independent facilitators, etc. And then the idea here is that we can make observations, so we can observe things and we can create hypotheses. And that's the exercise I want to do with you, but not with this one because there's not enough inputs. But you can play around and check it out. So this, for example, is the triangle where you had to what influence, and you can see, okay, so there might be important emerging issues seems to be the case for this part of it. So you can see the stories that come out and etc. You see the distribution. Again, create observations to hypotheses. And here's a good one. So you say, where were the sources of the context about the work came from? So conversation with participants seem to be your go-to way for the stories you've shared. So we can look at those, but we can look at those. You can also look at this, for example, as 2 stories where conversation with participants were not so much in place, but documents and data and the contracting with the client were more prominent. Yeah. So what is the difference between those 2 and the other ones? We can create hypotheses about that. Yeah. So it's a minority cluster that might show us something that is interesting as well. So you can play with vector analysis, which is quite nice. It's AI making a little bit of suggestions of what you could look at and everything else. And I'm going to create this public dashboard and copy and give it to you here in the chat, and you can check it out later. You don't have to look at it now, but it will show you exactly what we've been looking at here. Yeah, you can play around, you can select, and you can read the stories and all that. So now the real example from a real client, so we can exercise a little bit this hypothesis idea and still have time to check. So, so here it is. This is a real client report. Obviously, I took out the names and everything else. But a quick, so what was this? This client was organization in Brussels I was living in the UK and working with this group in Brussels. And they had members in many different parts of Europe. And they were working, and there was this secretariat and this group in Brussels who would facilitate the exchange of decisions between the members. It's a very complex organization because they are sovereign, so they're managed by like the different institutions in different countries, but they also want to contribute to this central space in Brussels, central office, because that's what makes them talk to each other in the best way. But they were struggling with decision making, and the people in Brussels asked us to ask the members about what they're thinking, their feelings and experience with the central group in Brussels. So what is the experience of being a member in a sense? So we asked them to tell the experience. So tell me about an experience of being a member of this organization. It could be a bad experience, good experience, everything goes. So they did share. And this is what came out, which is a little bit like what we've seen in our case there, but with more inputs. And then I want to show you a correlation. We asked 2 questions to them. We asked them, in the role that you were playing, so how much influence did you have in the decisions and outcomes that came out on this central organization in Brussels? And they said, this was out of my hands completely, or I highly influenced it. And another question was, in that role, how much did you feel this organization, this central organization, represented your interests in the experience you described? And then they said, they did not represent my interests, and they fully represent my interests. Yeah. So there's a correlation, and this is not surprising, of course. It means that the correlation only means that the more they were able to influence the decision, they feel more represented by it. And I think that makes obviously sense, because they are part of making the decision or influencing the decision, so they feel they fully represented. So that's great. So what we look at here is we can look at, for example, on the top right, what are the stories, what are the experiences of being fully represented and being highly influenced? And then people will tell stories of, so I had a need for technical support, they were really helpful, so they're really cooperative, and so they'll tell some stories that might give us an idea of when it makes sense or when people feel or experience full representation and being able to highly influence. We can also look at the other way around and to look at, well, in the places that I did not participate, so it's completely out of my hands, the decision, but I also didn't feel represented at all. So it was completely, so I didn't feel I was there, and I should be maybe represented on that decision. I didn't touch it, and I don't feel represented. Again, and this, we can get some quotes. Everything you see on the right-hand side are quotes, like literally copy and paste quotes of little parts, and we show this to the client. We don't show the whole story necessarily for some cases, because we want to make sure it's anonymous, but we show some quotes about it. Yeah. So now I'm going to send it to you in a little work group, understanding that you don't have all the context, but still a little bit of an exercise. So imagine that we're looking at this same graph here. We saw that there's people who feel fully represented and influenced highly. We saw that people were not represented but did not influence. But also there's a big group here of people who felt that their interests were fully represented, but they did not influence at all. So they did not, so it's completely out of their hands, and yet they felt represented. My question to you is, what hypothesis, before we read the stories, which is usually what we do, what hypotheses can we make about what's going on here, where people still feel fully represented, and yet they had completely no influence in the outcome? Yeah. So that's my question. So my suggestion is we make breakout group, just maybe 4 minutes, Yes, thank you, Fernando. Maybe 4 minutes. What are our hypotheses? So my challenge to you is we need more than one. 2 is enough, but 1 is not sufficient, and I'll explain why. So at least 2. So the question, you want the questions on the sides, you mean? Okay, we'll do that. What do you mean?
The breakout room. What you want us to talk about in the breakout room?
Yes, thank you. Sorry. So I want you to come up with hypotheses of why people might have chosen that specific part of the graph, meaning being fully represented and yet not really participating in the decisions. Why might that be that people decided their experiences fell into that specific position? A couple hypotheses. Okay, let's try it out. First time might be a little weird, but let's try it out.
Let's say 5 minutes, Augusto, in
Yes,
triads.
that's perfect. Yes, that's lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Here we go. De vuelta.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we're gonna open up for questions, and then you can also bring your experience of how hard that was. If you want to share in the chat a hypothesis or 2 or what you came up with, why not? What I'm going to share is, like, for example, what came to mind for me. So please do write in the chat if you want your hypothesis. But what came out to me when looking at that, before reading the stories or anything, was like, what if? Yeah, it's a bit of a what if question, hypothesis. So we can inquire about, so would this be different types of decisions, maybe? Not the same type of decisions that other people are doing, some different types of decisions. Would this be, so maybe processes and structures are perceived as being representative and trustful for these people. So people, they trust the process more than the others that decided to put their dot somewhere else. So maybe this is a specific group or subgroup of members that trust the representativeness of the organization rather than others. It might be, again, there being different decisions. Maybe some decisions require participation. Some others, people feel that they don't need to participate. They're happy to. Super. And there's some others coming up here. So thank you for sharing. But the exercise in itself is we want to create this hypothesis. So this will be an idea that when you step into the room, people will, and we were talking about this, people might come up and say, oh, we're doing this or not doing that because of A, because of X, or because of something. And you have some data to say, well, I hear that you're talking about A, but now I have some things here that tell me about B that sometimes might be a bit contradictory. Let me read you a couple of quotes. And then you go there and you read a couple of quotes. But while B might be the case as much as A, so you bring a little bit of havoc in the room. So you're facilitating by making a bit of a mess, in the sense of, like, this is a conversation that we need to talk about, because it seems that everybody agrees, but when people talk about anonymously about it, there's a good group of people that have a different opinion or might have a different opinion. Why don't we explore this? And that's a way of trying to bring the conversation to like differences that make a difference, things that might move forward, rather than staying on everybody agrees on the first thing that comes up, and that's the story as it's been told forever in the organization or the team. Yeah. So this is a way of, and not surprisingly, sometimes people will not be the whistleblower. They won't raise their hand and say, well, you know what? I think this is a problem. I think this is a challenge. But if someone comes and says, this seems to be a pattern, people, and that pattern relates to that problem or that challenge, they will happily raise their hand and say, I don't know who wrote this, but it resonates with me. Yeah. So it depersonalizes in a way that we're not talking about the person who raised their hand, but we're talking about how a pattern resonates with different people. And then we can talk about the pattern and start talking about people, which makes a big of a difference for power relations and how things show up in the organization. Yeah, it doesn't mean there's no power relations and that you can talk about anything, but at least it opens up the possibility of conversations that previously you might not have had a chance to talk to. Okay, so I think that's it. I'll just open up for, if you want to talk about the experience of creating hypothesis. The reason is more than one, I think that's important, I forgot to say, is we want to exercise possibility. It's very easier to make one hypothesis when you listen to a client. You use all your background in your experience and you want to make sense of it as a human being, and you create a hypothesis of what might be going on. This helps, but hinders your work at the same time. Like once you lock into one, it's very hard to let it go. That we say it's just like, don't think about the pink elephant. There's a pink elephant hovering in front of your head almost immediately. So to have multiple hypotheses help you to be open for what ifs, so you don't cling into one that seems to be the preferred one. My teacher, the person who, we're going to send you those links, who taught me Participatory Narrative Inquiry, she said that the client must not know the hypothesis you prefer. This is your job. You have to create hypotheses that they don't know which one. You might prefer one, it's normal, but the one that you prefer. So you're giving enough to think about, including to yourself, so you can see different possibilities rather than the one that's the preferred or even the most likely. So you're open to that. And then you're going to test by reading the stories. You're going to test by bringing that into the group and seeing how people respond in the here and now. So that's a bit of the work that I think goes well with facilitation. Yeah, you helping to arrive with what people want to talk about, and then you can plug into the conversation. A little bit of hit the road running on the first start. I developed a process called Culture Sprint, so we can talk about what's going on in the sprint. We're going to send you the link for that too. But it can be used to any process that you work and you facilitate. So I hope you plug in and try. And I'm always open for any kind of support or the user platform. Yeah, that's it.
I had a question, if that's possible. It's great. Thank you. I was curious on the hypothesis, like two bits. Like there's one of when doing the hypothesis. Would you do those with the participants too? Would you sort of start to encourage them to frame them up? And then secondly, how would you, just facilitating discussion around them? I'd just be curious how you kind of take it to that next bit.
Wonderful. And thank you. I think the answer is yes. It's a great possibility. So if you can, so there are many levels of this. One is you can bring the stories anonymized or make sure it's anonymous, but you can bring all the stories back. So the platform allow you to, for example, to print cards, story cards from every story, so you can handle to people. They can read and they can cluster themselves, the stories. Apart from the graphs, they can cluster the story. They can make sense as they read the stories and cluster them. This takes time. Sometimes the client is not really interested in the amount of time. So the communities are more because they want to be, anyway, so it depends. In between, it could be you create some hypotheses. I'm sorry, you create some clusters and you ask people to create a hypothesis with you. That's great. It's better. There's more participation. Again, more time. Not everybody's interested in creating a hypothesis, which is harder than the general workshop, I would say, but very much it makes more sense because then it's not you creating the hypothesis or you and your team, but a participation of more people. It's even better. And then there's a third one, which fortunately or unfortunately is what usually most of the cases are, is we have time to create some hypotheses and clusters and bring those hypotheses and clusters for people to reflect upon. And then they create hypotheses on top of that. We can throw some out, of course, because the idea is that if you nail the hypothesis, something is wrong. The idea is not to make it right; is to create the possibility for the conversation. So you can get to that point where you can you It's a bit shorter.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's not perfect most of the time, but that's where we can get. Yeah.
Really great. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the session too.
Thank you.
Hi. Actually, I believe Sammy had put up his hand before, if I'm not mistaken, to ask a question.
No, thanks.
No? Okay, yeah. I actually, one of our members in our group, Salvatore, actually had a good observation. Yeah, I don't know if you want to ask your question about representation versus inclusion. I can ask if. Yeah, okay. Yeah, he had a good observation where he said, what, like, to have clarity about what representation meant, whether it was like me as an individual being involved in that conversation, or that I feel like someone in my position and role similar to me is in that conversation. So I might not be in that meeting or whatever, but I'm represented. So we were just curious to see the definition of it.
Right. You mean for that particular case?
Yes. And in general, I'm assuming this is like a regular maybe question that you ask about representation and whether it's individual based or position based.
Right. Well, in that particular case is so there's no other way but representation, right? It's just our democracy. It's the best we've got if we're represented by our representative elected, because there's no other way to organize the complexity of things, and that's the case on that organization as well. I think in general that's a good question. I don't think I'm equipped to. I think you might be represented but not be included, maybe in some ways, or you can be included in the conversation but not be represented when it goes to the next level. I think for this work, the distinction that I think matters is that we don't want to individualize. So it's not an inclusion per having everybody together. It's like we want to make sure that everybody is listening. We want to find the patterns that should be represented on the next level. Yes, in a way that depersonalized from the person, but it talks about what's going on, the perception of what's going on in place. So not really what people think. Yeah, sometimes I joke and say, like, I don't care what people think, but I do care what they experience and how they see their experience. Yeah, because what people think can be like it's impossible to represent what people think because everybody thinks differently, and it's never the same, which is great. But you can represent patterns of experience at some level. So that's what I would say. I don't know if that's clear. It's coming up now. So good question.
Thank you.
Annika put a question in the chat.
Wonderful. Annika, I think I work with P&I because of that. Yeah, I think partially because of that. Because I think people have been called to do lots of surveys, and there's a level of trust that you can create by, for example, making interviews and talking to people face to face, and that does not go away. And you can still do that and do the survey and P&I. But to bring the real challenges, it's part of this emotional connection and the trust they have in you, but also how much they feel that they can share something with someone who's coming from outside or from another place. And some people will feel that they can share. You might have a good connection with some people and they feel they can share with you. Sometimes it has to do with your skill, but sometimes it has to do with their experience with people that look like you, or with consultants, or with the past projects that they've done that might look similar. So unless you have a big group of people that can, like 10 facilitators or 10 consultants that can work with the client, this is a good way to as a supplement of feeling and emotionally connecting with participants before, during, and after, is to listen to them by anonymously collecting their experiences. I think that's what I can
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other question or comment?
I had another commentary.
Yeah.
I'm not writing it in the chat. It just popped up. I would imagine in this process, you kind of referred to this before when we were speaking about that the client, maybe the leader of the group, is hiring you, and you've fallen before in the trap of selling what they want you to, that individual might want you to sell to their group, right? So in this kind of narrative inquiry, how does that shape also the conversations that you have with the client to kind of set the context for them and actually have trust with them? Because they also might feel kind of threatened, I'm assuming, with this process. So like, how would you have the buy-in for them? Because if it's, I would imagine the degree that the participants would feel open to have trust and open up is also
Yes.
about how open the client is to having this happen.
Absolutely. That's a great question, Ara, because I think one thing is we don't want to be vehicles of having the conversation that the leadership thinks, again, is not ill intended. It's just like the only thing that they see. But we also not promising that we're going to have all the conversations that we want to have just because participants or people who answered want to have those conversations. Things, they take time. And one of the things that the ability and the sensibility to know when it's time to open up the conversation is also part of the work. And it's not an easy one. It's not something that you can teach or have a model or something. But what we can do is, and we're there to serve also the contract that we've done with the organization, with the leader. Sometimes the leader is the one, or whoever, like I'll call the leader, but it's the person who is calling us in. They hold the anxiety, the highest anxiety in the room, because they're hiring you because they want to do something in the organization, but they don't want this to show up something that will explode their process, their group, or their organization, because that doesn't do good for them. So the idea is not that we're going to investigate something and put it out there because we are Superman or Wonder Woman, that we're going to open up what's been the Pandora box that hasn't been opened forever. But it's a conversation about trying to understand. And most leaders don't know, or it's hard to know what other people see truly, what they really experience. And again, because they're very far from the leader, the experience are different. They say that it's open, but then the organization doesn't really allow for that openness for all the reasons we know, although saying they do. So the leader is also happy to get some of the other ways of looking, because it's not personalized. We can say, and sometimes, and I had clients that said that we don't want to talk about this. I don't want this, no. And we don't. Yeah. Or we do in a certain level that doesn't seem threatening or won't show up. And so we're there to serve that client, to serve that leadership as well. So we're not going to go against them. So the idea is, if you want to understand more the context of what's going on beyond your perception, we can do P&I, we can do Participatory Narrative Inquiry. We're not going to open a conversation against your interests, but we're going to be fair, coming back to you and say, this is a conversation you should have. Yeah, there are instances that people said, we don't want to have that conversation. And I said, I'm here to serve you. But I also have to say that unless, what it seems from the data is that unless this conversation is in the room, the problem you're facing will not go away. And that's all I can do. And then there's going to be ready when it's ready and when they feel it's ready. Yeah, and then our ability to create a space that's not threatening. So I'm not going to go over the client, but then I can be like, I can say this, the data saying this or is implying this. There's a conversation. We can think how to do it in a better way. But yeah, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we have just 1 minute to close, and I just want to you to write in the chat anything that you find, something that you're gonna keep chewing on. So what is your takeaways from today's session? So please write in the chat. And while you're typing, I just want to say thank you so much, Augusto, for coming and sharing your knowledge or your work with us. I think it's always good to have, some insights and something different. It's always, our minds goes to different places, and so then we can have different insights and get our practices better. So thank you so much.
Thank you for
Yeah,
inviting
thank
me,
you,
both of
Augusto.
you.
Fernando.
Thanks everyone for coming. And we'll be sending the resources on your way soon, later today. Yeah, see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Soon,
you.
cheers.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
You too.